Here are the top 10 facts to know before starting Pride and Prejudice. First off, an apology and an explanation. The first time I read Pride and Prejudice, I wasn't a reader growing up, and the first time I read this novel was as a either freshman or sophomore English major, as an undergraduate in a survey course in which the teacher was really good, but it may have been that I wasn't quite intelligent or mature enough to appreciate Elizabeth Bennet, or it may be that I didn't really understand the historical and cultural context in which the novel was written. I didn't have a full appreciation of the stakes of every seemingly irrelevant moment. And I think what I'd like to do in the next several minutes is to present nothing comprehensive and really nothing exhaustive. There's a lot more I can say about each of these issues and terms, but just to give a little introduction to the world around Pride and Prejudice and around Jane Austen as she wrote this novel. And in that way, maybe we can appreciate why these characters care so fiercely about what it is they care about. First, the novel was written during what's called the Regency era. After King George III was deemed insane, his son Prince George, later King George IV, was put in charge as Prince Regent. The Regency era technically lasted from 1811 to 1820, but historians debate on its longer influence, perhaps from 1780 up until the ascendancy of Queen Victoria to the throne in 1837. The Regency era was the end of the Georgian era through the reigns of George the First, Second, Third, and Fourth. And it was a period in which the ruling class lived lavish, extravagant, and scandal-filled lifestyles. And just a quick anecdote to discuss the sort of lavish, or to give an image to the lavish lifestyles of particularly the Prince Regent himself. The Prince Regent and other corpulent men had, with all their costume, had nowhere to hide all their bulk, and they turned to corsets to cinch their waists, to appear thinner and also just to fit in their clothes. The Prince Regent himself, his corset famously creaked when he moved. Cravats, the sort of makeshift, the ties of the time period, got larger, and tying them became this complex competitive process between gentlemen. The Regency era was a time, particularly among upper class men, of moral laxness, and the Regency era led, to a large extent, to the straight-laced morality of the Victorians. We probably read Jane Austen and think this is a very sort of morally buttoned-up time, but the greater context of the Regency era was quite the opposite, and the Victorian sort of response to that was a sort of hyper-morality. So Jane Austen is often criticized when people read her 6 novels, that the tumultuous world of the Regency period isn't reflected in her novels, that her novels sort of paint with too narrow a brush. The fact of the matter is that during the Regency period, England itself was fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and that, as one scholar put it, you couldn't throw a rock without hitting a soldier. There were soldiers quite literally everywhere. Now, in her novels, and in particular Pride and Prejudice, becoming a soldier, buying a commission and becoming a soldier was a particularly interesting way to become a gentleman. And a soldier in the presence of young ladies was often quite electric, and as we'll see in the novel. But it is a world, the Regency period was a world where soldiers were quite everywhere. And it's interesting that Jane Austen famously doesn't really have scenes in which 2 men are talking without the presence of a woman. But she is aware of the world outside of the villages she writes about. And I would conclude this point by saying that it's almost Shakespearean, that in Shakespeare's greatest plays, his characters have layered conflicts within their own hearts. His characters' communities, if you think of Hamlet's own inner conflict or Macbeth's own inner conflict, has an echo in the community they're in, which also then it resonates to conflicts with other kingdoms and other countries. And I would say that Austen has her own version of this. We don't get soldierly accounts very often. We don't get reports of the battlefield, but there is this ubiquitous presence of warfare outside of the comfort of these drawing rooms that I think is really interesting, and it's in Pride and Prejudice as well. In terms of the economy during the Regency, quite interesting. The Regency saw very significant economic changes. Previously, England was mostly an agrarian economy. Now, the first large factories begin to appear, and we see the shift to a more industrial economy, and later what's to be called the Industrial Revolution. I think all that's interesting and relatively easy to understand, but what's peculiar to, I think, what Austen writes about is she, in a very subtle way, shows the insecurity of these changes among her characters, that this is an unsettled, uncertain society with uncertain futures. Everything is changing, and no one understands the rules. Much is made now about the automation of work that once was done by actual human beings. And I think that's the 21st century version of the sort of anxiety that Austen's characters are sometimes dealing with in regard to the economic shifts of its time. If one were to ask a Jane Austen fan in one word, what are her novels about? That fan would probably say marriage. But there's some peculiar details about courtship and marriage that I'd like to discuss. They actually have a significant bearing on our reading of Pride and Prejudice. First of all, unmarried men and women could not have private conversations. Unmarried men and women could not express feelings or emotions towards each other. Unmarried men and women could not call each other by their first names. Unmarried men and women could not write letters to each other. All of those details end up being interesting when we see some of the moments in Pride and Prejudice that to us might not be a big deal, but if you know these sort of cultural rules, end up being significantly bold and one might say revolutionary. When a woman married at this time period, she really signed away her entire life to her husband, really except for what was called the marriage portion, which is a sum of money that the woman's family would reserve on the chance that she would become a widow. But for the most part, her sort of legal and financial identity became null and void. Marriage at this time was purely a business arrangement. The idea of marriage for love is quite a recent phenomenon. There really was no expectation that your emotional needs were going to be met by your spouse. Your emotional needs were supposed to be met by your friends, maybe the raising of children, and if you were coy about it, in extramarital affairs, which were pretty ubiquitous at the time. The job of marriage was to create an heir, to stabilize your family line. That was it. That was the purpose of getting married. Interestingly, Jane Austen's novels are full of interesting readers that I would argue are very different from the sorts of reading that women of the time period read. Yes, Jane Austen's heroines and real people during the Regency period would read the Bible pretty much daily, would read famous books of sermons in a way to sort of apply the Bible to their daily life. Shakespeare was sort of the national treasure writer of choice. But maybe most peculiarly were these conduct books, including the frontispiece here, Beadle's Dime, a book of practical etiquette for ladies and gentlemen, being a guide to true gentility and good breeding, etc., etc. These were very common. And there are sort of social media online versions of these now about how men and women are supposed to be. But the rules and regulations of relationships and about behavior socially were extremely clearly delineated. For example, women were not supposed to talk like men. Women were supposed to keep speak when spoken to, and were supposed to keep their discourse to domestic and family matters. You weren't supposed to make bold claims about politics, for example. You weren't supposed to speak passionately or make people laugh. You were certainly, as a young woman, never to be alone with an unmarried gentleman. You would have to wait to be introduced to someone publicly. You couldn't walk up to a stranger and say what your name was and shake his or her hand. You had to wait. That was the etiquette of the time. And something else that appears important, that ends up being important in Pride and Prejudice, is that you would never, as a single woman, dance with the same man more than twice at one ball. And this seems silly. Dances are often 20 or 30 minutes each, so you could see why that might be the case. It would cause a bit of a scandal. But pay attention later in the novel where Mr. Collins breaches this etiquette. It's quite interesting. What I'd like to also say is that if you were to read Jane Austen's 6 completed novels, one sort of theme or common denominator of the heroines, as different as they are, which they are very different, they all carve out quiet time in their life for reading, and it's usually reading literature. And it's interesting that these characters' growth, I feel, is often in direct correlation to their private contemplative reading. Pay attention in Pride and Prejudice to what people say when Elizabeth Bennet is reading. I think it's quite revolutionary and interesting and true. One of the significant gaps between our understandings of our society and those of the Regency period is the definition of a gentleman. Nowadays, gentleman is a behavioral distinction. One behaves as a gentleman, but at the time of the Regency, being a gentleman means that you did not soil your hands with work. That's what it meant. This also meant that you were a landowner and that you received rents and so forth from people who worked on your land, so you did not have to work for your income. What's interesting is that if you earned, say, 2,000 pounds a year from rents from your land and you didn't work, and your next door neighbor owned a successful business and was worth, say, 100,000 pounds, you would still outrank him because you didn't work for your money. So higher status really wasn't about choices, effort, or work. Having a higher status as a gentleman was more a function of genetic lottery, frankly. So this is another thing that I think is important because Jane Austen, in all of her novels, but certainly in this novel, is obsessed with money and how much money people have coming in and how much money people need. We know very early on that the Longbourn estate's income, the estate that the Bennet sisters and Mr. and Mrs. Bennet live on, earns them 2,000 pounds a year. It's a lot of money. We know that the Pemberley estate, where Darcy lives, earns 10,000 pounds a year, which would make him, according to some scholars, one of the richest single men in England at the time. Here's the important thing to keep in mind. A middle-class family, in order for a middle-class family to live comfortably, they would have to earn 250 pounds a year. That's the benchmark that we have. That's not what a wealthy family needs, but you can live comfortably as a middle-class family on 250 pounds a year. So in light of that fact, let's talk about an estate, primogeniture, an entail, and a dowry, because these are terms that pertain more to the characters we're going to read about, not middle-class people looking to just be comfortable, but wealthy people looking to secure their line and their estate for generations to come. An estate, the definition of an estate really hasn't changed that much. An estate then, as it is now, is the land, money, and property owned by a person or a family. So again, the average family can live comfortably on 250 pounds a year. And I said, Longbourn earns 2,000 pounds a year, which seems like a lot until you realize that there's 5 girls there and that money has to be divided. The Pemberley estate earning 10,000 pounds a year is obviously an incredibly wealthy piece of property. Women could inherit property, but usually the son, for a variety of reasons I'll get into, inherited the estate or the nearest male relative. Now, primogeniture ends up being one of the most important features of the book and of the time period. Primogeniture is simply the premise that the estate of a family automatically descends to the eldest son. Primogeniture, it's in the etymology of the word. The estate of a family automatically descends to the eldest son. The Bennets have 5 daughters. There is no eldest son. So readers often ask, well, could the daughters split the estate? Absolutely, that happens sometimes. In fact, Anne, Lady Catherine's daughter in the novel, is an only child and is the heir to the opulent Rosings Park, which we'll hear more about. But there's 5 daughters here. And once they start marrying, the woman's property in a marriage becomes the husband's property. And you can see how that could complicate who manages long-born estate. So what often happens is that a father, like Mr. Bennet, would entail his estate to the nearest male relative. An entail is when the father, in this instance, Mr. Bennet, bequeaths his estate to the nearest male relative. What's said in the documents of the day, the male heirs of my body. So Mr. Bennet, because he has no sons, entails his estate to his cousin, Mr. Collins, who's you'll love and is one of the great comic, sort of cringeworthy characters in all of literature. But an entail is really the key. Knowing what an entail is the key to the conflict of the entire novel, Pride and Prejudice. And this is why right from the very first page, Mrs. Bennet's seemingly silly anxiety about her daughter's romantic or marital status is actually quite legitimate. She seems silly on the surface. But the fact of the matter is, legally and economically speaking, the day Mr. Bennet dies, all of these girls lose everything and they become essentially homeless outside of the generosity of other people. So very, very important to understand that. Something interesting is Jane Austen herself was a vicar's daughter in a large family, and when her dad died, she and her unmarried sister Cassandra lost their home, her dad's income, and they bounced from relative to relative, essentially, homeless and reliant on other people's generosity. So she has some sense experientially and emotionally of what it feels like to be a young woman who is sort of wrapped up in the sort of economic complexity of things like primogeniture and entailments. And then last but not least, the dowry, which is a term that most of us might know. And it's simply the money a woman's husband gets for marrying. It gets from the woman's father usually. And this is clearly a long time before the Me Too movement, but the purpose of the dowry is even kind of odder. The purpose is to compensate the man for the expense of having a wife in the first place. The husband could actually legally do whatever he wanted with the dowry. And when the woman married, the woman basically lost her legal standing as a human being. She pretty much belonged to her husband, and she had no legal recourse unless there was a prenuptial agreement, which were obviously pretty rare at the time. But the reason I'm obviously not an economist, and these are very sort of surface level explanations, but the anxiety, the economic anxiety that lives in this novel drives this novel. And it often is easily forgotten because people have servants and cooks and gardeners and people dress nicely and speak nicely. And it sometimes can feel like a world without economic anxiety. But it's really sort of like now when people are okay, but they're 1 or 2 paychecks away from not being okay. This is sort of like that's like the 21st century version of Pride and Prejudice, I would argue. What is a vicar and what is a living? So being a gentleman is great if you're the oldest son in a family. You inherit everything because of primogeniture and everything is wonderful. But if you're a son who's not the first son and you still want to be a gentleman, there are a few ways to do that. So the first is the clergy, and this is where the vicarage comes in. A vicar is a clergyman. About 2/3 of the students at Cambridge University during the Regency period were there to become clergymen. At that point, you'd be ordained a curate or a low-level clergyman. They were always poor when they started out. They would work for the vicar, earn about £50 a year. We know that that's totally not enough to raise a family on. Becoming a vicar, which is the clergyman in charge of an entire parish or like a community of people, involved pretty much knowing people or being in the right place at the right time. These jobs were funded by the parish and allowed the vicar a living. The definition of a living is a guaranteed income for life from the parish. Again, parish isn't, in this instance, a church building only. It's an entire community. Because vicars not only did what you expect a vicar to do, help the poor, baptisms, weddings, funerals, but they would also do things like manage the roads and help with social services. So they were like a combination religious institution and the Department of Public Works all wrapped into one. But being a vicar had an incredible lifelong stability attached to it. And that's why Collins is on the surface appealing. That's why characters who have livings that are turned away from them. You'll see some things with Wickham later in the novel. There's a lot riding on being a vicar. The other ways to become gentlemen are the military, the law, and certain forms of medicine. What's interesting is if I don't have to work because I was born in a particular family first, and I just sit around drinking claret and reading novels, which, by the way, sounds great, I would be considered higher on the social chain than someone who works really hard as a soldier, lawyer, doctor, or clergyman. And that's just the status and the stage we're in here. In terms of challenges to reading Pride and Prejudice, some of them pertain to challenges to reading all old, difficult classic books. And here are some reading tips I have for Pride and Prejudice. First, as best you can, and this is always really difficult, keep 2020, keep the current year you're in at the door. It's going to be really easy to sort of get upset that things move as slowly as they do, that people don't speak their mind the way they seem that they should, that people aren't transparent in the way that they should be, that people don't talk back when they should talk back. Let the novel present its own set of rules to you as you read, and we can discuss what you think of them as time goes on. But this novel creates its own internal universe with its own internal set of rules, and we can talk about that. Secondly, keep the high stakes of all these moments in mind. The fact that someone moves into a neighborhood drives the drama of the first few pages, the first chapter of the novel. We had someone move into my neighborhood in Peabody recently. We talked about it at dinner with my family. It did not feel like this. It did not feel like the first few pages of Pride and Prejudice. Why are certain people encouraged to marry other people or discouraged from marrying them? It all has to do with the economic stakes at hand. So keep those stakes in mind. Because the novel is just, from a language point of view, so beautiful, I would really recommend getting a good version of it either on YouTube or even better, Audible. Do the speed of the reading what you want it to be and listen to a chapter or two a day and read along with the reader. It's a great way to experience a great book. And if it's frustrating because it goes too slow, that's actually a reason to do it. It forces you to slow down and appreciate this language in a whole different way, particularly if you really are familiar with the book and you want to experience it in a new way. Fourth, and this maybe goes against English teacher sensibilities, but as you're reading something for the first time, I would say this for every book you ever read, do not worry about the deeper meaning of moments, the symbolism. If it's stormy outside, don't try to resist the urge to read too much into that, right? So it's because you want to experience the novel unfolding before you in real time. We don't search for deep meaning constantly when we're at the movie theater. There's no reason to do it the first time you read Pride and Prejudice. Attempt to enjoy the novel on the first reading. And lastly, because we're going to be talking about Pride and Prejudice, and I'm encouraging you not to sort of interpret as you read, what I do suggest doing with your hard copy of the book is every page or two, write, a question, underline a favorite sentence, bracket a moment that surprises you. something that you're wondering and you want to ask about, write a little question mark. I call it funderlining. It isn't simply underlining because we're dealing with great literature. It's fun, so therefore it's funderlining. But I would say don't be one of those people that you might have known in college that highlights the entire book. That's no good. But because you're going to be talking about it, you want a record of your reactions. Minimal. I'd say every couple of pages, maybe one little mark. Like I said, question mark, exclamation point. If I like a quote, I'll sometimes put quotes around the sentence on the page. Just something to think about in your reading. Here's the works cited for all the images. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and that you enjoy Pride and Prejudice. It's really a reading experience like nothing else.